Did y'all switch papers? I'd rather come out for yes. But Shannon was on a good guesser.
All right.
No, they don't.
Okay, I see that we're recording.
Yep.
All right. It's my other computer is thinking. So
Get on the screen yet.
all right. I can give you the answers to your quiz. All right. The very first one is a B. In other words, it was mainly written in Babylon. I'm assuming everybody got that one after last week. All right. Sorry, Ralph, you weren't with us. Maybe you should have. Maybe as long as you did your reading, you can take this quiz. Number 2 is D. All of these. And I think we talked about a variety of ways that he could have been in contact. Number 3 is D as well. Now, some of these are from your reading, obviously. Number 4 is true. It was common for ancient Near Eastern rulers to rob and to borrow cultural ideas and literature from other cultures. Number 5, that is false. It was very likely that the dominant nation which Ezekiel may have borrowed ideas from is not Persia, but it's Babylon. Number 6 is C. You recall reading that in the text about the poem of Era? We'll talk a little bit about that. That's going to become very important when we get to chapters 10, chapter 10 in particular, chapter 9 and 10, I should say. Let's see, 7, that is true. Ezekiel can be seen as a transitional book between the classical prophets and the later apocalyptic. It's because of his imagery that he uses, and it's often used within the apocalyptic literature. And 8 is B. Ezekiel was pro-Babylonian because he saw them as being used by God to correct Judah. The bonus question, did anybody get the bonus question? It was C. Yes?
Wait, did I get it? No.
Now, maybe those were too hard. I'll have a look at how your grades are on those, and we'll see. If I have to do some curving, I will.
How do we grade? Like, which amendments work? Like 2020 or something?
Okay, did that other one get connected?
Oh, but
Nope, I don't see it at all.
Okay, one moment.
so the bonus doesn't count as a minus, right?
No.
Okay.
That's because it looks like my computer locked up. We've been having problems with our internet as well.
Well, I think our problem is more with our sound, so I don't think that was you.
Okay, well, that one I will start, and maybe at the break we can try it again. If not, what I'll do is I'll just put the one and do it right behind me.
All right. Well, I can show the PowerPoint to them here also.
Okay, so the PowerPoint right now, I'm on the map. I think that's where we left off last week. But before we start, I will start in a word of prayer, and hopefully this will, for the next couple hours, we can stay connected.
All righty. Thank you.
All right, let's pray. Father, we thank you for this night. I ask, God, that you would be with us in our discussions. I pray that you would be glorified in the learning process. We ask this, Father, in your name. Amen.
Hey, Brian, do you take off the lowest score of our quizzes?
Do I drop one?
Yeah.
Well, I think there might be some room for that. I want to look at seeing how the students are doing. Like I said, I've used these quizzes before when I taught the class this summer, and they seem to work okay, but that is also a different dynamic when I'm in the classroom. And so we'll see. If I have to curve it and make it out of, give you an extra couple points, I will do that. Before I begin, sorry for the delay here, but are there any questions based upon your readings thus far? I know that you had the first, I think, 40 pages or so to read, and I do apologize, that first chapter is kind of dense. After chapter 1, after the first 90 pages or so, it starts getting into the content of the book, and I discuss and I work through the content. But I did want to spend at least a class or so setting up the basic understanding of Ezekiel and how scholars have looked at it, because we could talk about all the spiritual disciplines we want, but at the end of the day, one of the things that I find is just as spiritual is to validate the Word of God in the sense of being an apologist for the faith as well. And so I interact as much as I can with the scholars and try to present why I feel that there's some major problems with some of the perspectives of the scholars and agree with others. There are some that have a very good understanding of the text. And so that's what we will be doing, if not by the end of this class, hopefully throughout the next class. But before I begin picking up where we had left off last week, because we were looking at the history and what was going on leading up to the exile of Ezekiel in 597, I was just curious if there were any questions based upon what you have read thus far.
I have a question. I'm going to turn towards
Turn toward the computer.
So, in the reading, you stressed that Ezekiel borrowed a lot from several of the ancient Near East cultures, primarily Assyria and Babylon.
Yes.
And then it seemed at some points in the reading, the term or the region Mesopotamia was used.
Yes.
Can you help me understand the delineation or the description of Mesopotamia versus Assyria and or Babylon?
Okay, that's a great question. Mesopotamia is a term that is used for the general region. So I think you have a map up there right now that you're looking at. I think that was what was on the PowerPoint. Yes, that map there. That whole region that's kind of in the light tan brown color, that's the Near East. Now, Mesopotamia is technically the region in and around the rivers. So between the rivers. So you have the Euphrates and the Tigris. So Babylon and Assyria fall within that same area. If you go a little bit to the east of the Tigris, of course, you're in Persia. So Mesopotamia is the general term for, the region around Babylon, between the rivers. It can take in Assyria as well. When I'm speaking about the influences on Ezekiel himself, while Persia may have had a bit, even Canaanite thinking, it is still Babylon as a general rule that we're going to see has the most connections. And I think that was one of the questions on the quiz. Assyria is, there's some connections more so from perhaps the way they borrowed literature and whatnot, and a little bit maybe in their understanding of marriage covenants and agreements. But when it comes down to making the connections that I do, most of them come from ancient Babylon, and that's going to be down towards the Persian Gulf. So when the Neo-Babylonian Empire expands, it's going to take over everything that was Assyria. It's going to, one kind of encapsulates the other as they take over each other. And so when I worked through this, that was some of what I was going to do today, is I was going to talk to how we get from the Assyrian threat, which is in the period of Josiah in about 640 to 609. How do we get from the Assyrian threat to the Babylonian problem by the time of Ezekiel? And Ezekiel is living through this. He is watching major empire shifts going on. So for anybody, for example, who lived in Europe during the Second World War, they witnessed in their lifetime a total German occupation, then kind of the taking over of the Allies, then a handing back to the original, kind of back to the original borders for the most part. So they're experiencing the same type of turmoil. And that's what Ezekiel is going through. Ezekiel's going through those major empire shifts. The only difference is those empire shifts last for 50, 100, and sometimes even 200 years. So that's what I mean by that. Anything else? We good? All right, I'll take that as a no. And so I believe last class where we left off is I was talking about the rise of Nabopolassar, if I recall. Nabopolassar came to the throne, or he mounted a guerrilla warfare and came in and took over Babylon, or recaptured Babylon and liberated it from the Assyrians. Now in 627, that is the death of Ashurbanipal. And so he was the last of the great Assyrian rulers. And after him, there was 2 or 3, some put as many as 4 rulers that came in rapid succession. And so what happens is, and if you'll see on your map, I have some arrows there. Now, not all of the arrows are showing every battle that takes place, but some of them do. And so the very first one I want to look at, are you okay?
I'm trying to take a picture.
Well, you'll get it in your note. You got it in your notes.
Yes, I know.
Okay. Yeah, I sorry, I uploaded everything to your whatever your system is there, the resources. Sorry, we use Moodle. So I uploaded everything this afternoon, all of the PowerPoints. You should be able to pull up your PowerPoints and have them right on your computer out of your class on the electronic, what do you call it again, Len?
Student management system, yeah.
Okay, your management system?
This is the name of it.
Okay. So yeah, we're under days 1 to 4. So having noted that, what you get is in 626, he liberates, Nabopolassar liberates Babylon. And so this is going to be the beginning of the end for the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And it's also going to be the beginning of the end for Judah. And so this is the historical context within which Ezekiel is going to come. Of course, when was Ezekiel born? Do you remember what we talked about last week? I gave you his birth date, kind of his birth year, I should say. 623, 622. So this is just a few years before Ezekiel is born. And so what happens is, from about 626, over the next 12 years, what you get is Nabopolassar is solidifying his strength in Babylon. He is developing a kind of more centralized government, establishing the fact that now the Chaldeans, because he is actually a Chaldean, he is taking control. He is building an army, and he is forming alliances with the East, the nation of the Medes, which is modern-day Iran. And so you'll often hear the term the Medes and the Persians. Daniel talks about this. The Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, you've been weighed in the balances and found wanting, and your kingdom has been divided between the Medes and the Persians. The Medes and the Persians were actually 2 distinct groups, but they joined forces and become part of the great Persian Empire. So what happens is in 612, so about 13 years or so after, 13, 14 years after Nabopolassar liberates Babylon, he has enough military strength and political clout to now march and join forces with the Medes, and they march north and they attack Nineveh in 612. In 612, they destroy Nineveh. Now, this is the capital of the Assyrian Empire. And so what happens is, in 612, the remaining Assyrian army retreats along with their king, and they retreat west to a place called Haran. Now, I think Haran is on that map. And Nabopolassar marches back to Babylon and replenishes his forces. So from 612 down to about 609, so over about a 3-year period. And of course, I often ask the question, why does he wait 3 years to attack again? What would be the logistical reason for waiting 3 years?
Gather full strength.
Say that again, Desiree?
Gather their full strength.
Yeah, he's also got to re-strengthen his entire army. If you stop and consider, you've gone out and you fought a battle. Most of the soldiers were probably between 18 and 30, 35 years old. You lose a bunch of soldiers, you come back, you wait for 3 years, so now all of the 14, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds are all now coming into military age. And so he can replenish his military, restock, and he is going to march again west and try to, for the second time, to defeat the Assyrians once and for all at the Battle of Haran in 609. Now, there's also something else major going on in Israel at this time that's going to change the whole spiritual setting for the nation of Israel, or Judah in this case. By 609, Josiah has been having reforms going on for some time now. He has actually liberated portions of the northern empire, or the northern kingdom, what used to be Israel. He has taken that into his kingdom, so to speak, the kingdom of Judah. And as he begins to kind of flex his muscle, because the Assyrian strength is starting to diminish because of what happened at the Battle of Nineveh, and he's seeing the handwriting on the wall. If the Assyrians are destroyed, that means Israel is free, because they are a vassal to the Assyrians. And so in the meantime, what has happened is a guy by the name of Pharaoh Necho, that's Necho, and you'll often see it, I think the King James Version has it with the CH, but Pharaoh Necho, Dester, you're probably familiar with this. When we were doing excavations at Makadar in 2000, I think it was 15, if I recall, when we found the Samtic scarab. The scarab that Scott, Dr. Stripling, myself, and Dr. Sievers, and Baruch Halpern, or Baruch, I just lost his last name. Anyway, the guy from Israel, who is the specialist in scarabs, that particular scarab was actually from the dynasty, the 26th dynasty. That is the scarab from Pharaoh Necho's dynasty. And so here I was excavating in the sands of time, and I find his scarab. And so the Samtic scarab, Pharaoh Necho was of the Samtic dynasty. And so what happens is, because the Pharaoh in Egypt was still under Assyrian control. Remember, Ashurbanipal, you can pull up almost any map of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and it was under Esarhaddon and his son Ashurbanipal that they actually subjugate Egypt. And so now Pharaoh Necho is under the control of Egypt, or Assyria. Now, I don't know, did everybody get a chance to read over the vassal treaties of Esarhaddon? I know it's probably a little thick and a little heavy, but that's an ancient Near Eastern text. And there was also a text from the Hittite treaties that was just to kind of get you into a feel for how those treaties were written. That's actually a translation of an ancient treaty. The father of Ashurbanipal, that's Esarhaddon's treaties. And so what happened is, when Pharaoh Necho hears that the Assyrians are under attack, he marches the Egyptian army up along the coast, and he is going to head to Haran to try to help them, because he is a vassal of the Assyrians. And he's also recognizing the fact that as long as the Assyrians are weak, and as long as he is the savior of the Assyrians, it will give him a better place and give the Egyptians a better place kind of at the bargaining table. And they can maybe lighten up their taxation and whatnot. And so there are a lot of reasons why Pharaoh Necho would do this. And so he gets his army together, and in 609 starts marching it up the coast to Haran to actually help the Assyrians to try to thwart the attacks of Nabopolassar. Unfortunately, along the way, he stops at Megiddo, and Megiddo was under the control of the Egyptians at this time. And now, I'm sorry that map that you have in front of you, there should be an M on Megiddo. I think that just has an E, Beside it, it's the name is sticking out into the Mediterranean, but that should be Megiddo. And at that particular site, now this was an Egyptian stronghold, Josiah marches his small Judahite army out there thinking that he is going to thwart the attacks of or thwart the marching of the Egyptian army. And of course, you can read the story of what happens. This is in the Chronicler as well as in 2 Kings. Pharaoh Necho says to him, "What are you doing coming out here? My mission is from the Lord." And Josiah refuses to listen, and instead he engages Pharaoh Necho in battle, and he is killed in battle in 609. And of course, why this is important spiritually, the spiritual context. The death of one leader who was a godly man can change the total outcome of a nation. And in this case, that's why when now that I became an American citizen, I've done this for some time since I've lived in the U.S., I am constantly in prayer for the presidents, whoever the president of the United States is, because I want them to succeed and I want them to be protected. Because in some cases, it's what brings stability to the country. And so in this case, it was spiritual stability for the nation of Judah. And when Josiah died in 609, what is going to happen is they are going to have also a rapid succession of leaders put on the throne. And so they bring the children, or the Judahite army retreats in defeat. They bring Josiah's body back to Jerusalem, and they put his son, Jehoahaz, on the throne. Now, at this particular time, Pharaoh Necho doesn't have the time to deal with the men from Judah at this time, so he continues marching his army all the way north to Haran. He stops in Carchemish and then goes on over, according to the Chronicler, he stops in Carchemish and then he goes over to Haran. By the time he gets there in 609, the battle is over. The Babylonians, the Babylonian army under Nabopolassar has defeated the Assyrians, and the last few remaining Assyrians and the king retreat west again to Carchemish. And so you see on your map, the Battle of Haran is not noted, but you will notice that Carchemish, what's happening is the Babylonians are pushing the Assyrians further and further west. But the Babylonians also want to make sure that the Assyrians never rear their ugly heads again, because as long as the Assyrians there's a king alive, they can mount a revolt. And so what happens is Nabopolassar returns to Babylon in 609 after his victory, and he once again has to replenish his army. He is not going to be ready to march all the way west to Carchemish until 605. So approximately 3.5 years. So again, you do the math. What is he doing? He's replenishing his army with another group of young men coming through the ranks. He's also, getting resupplying his army. And this is why in the ancient world, just to kind of bring it into some modern context and some of the spiritual dilemma that's going on even in our culture today, in an ancient context, especially in these empires, abortion was absolutely forbidden. It was an attack against the gods, and it was an attack against the king. And the reason why it was so much frowned upon was not necessarily because they saw life in the womb as being super valuable, in which Israelites did, but they saw this as being an attack against the empire and the young men that would come up through the ranks to fight in the military. And so they needed bodies. And so therefore to attack a child in the womb was a direct affront to the king and to the gods. And so this is why, now today, obviously, we understand it from a different perspective. We value life, period. And so from a spiritual perspective, the reason I know for myself why I value life and life in the womb is because it is a life given by God. But for them, they understood it, yes, as a life given by the gods, but also as a body that's going to one day serve in the military. And so what happens in 605, it jumps for a period of time before that battle is going to take place. In the meantime, after Pharaoh Necho when he gets to the battle at Haran and he sees that the battle has been lost, he actually turns around and takes his army back down the coast. And as he's marching down the coast in 609, late 609, what he does is he puts pro-Egyptian men on all of the thrones of those small little empires, be it Damascus, be it the Phoenician Empire, be it what was once the Philistine Empire. And he comes to Jerusalem, and instead of allowing Jehoahaz to stay on the throne, he actually removes Jehoahaz and puts his brother on the throne, who is pro-Egyptian. And his brother's name is Jehoiakim. Do not confuse him with Jehoiachin, Chin. It is Jehoiakim, Kim. And so Jehoiakim is going to be placed on the throne by Pharaoh Necho. And what Necho does is he takes Jehoahaz, who has only been on the throne for 3 months, and he marches him down, and he's going to die in Egypt. So now we have a pro-Egyptian king on all of the thrones pretty much in the region of what is today Israel, Syria, and the Gaza and Lebanon. So these are all now pro-Egyptian puppets. Jehoiakim is one of them. So from that period of 609 to 605, Judah is basically pro-Egyptian. So by 605, Nebuchadnezzar, he wants to try to defeat the Assyrians once and for all and have an end to it. So what he does is he gets his son, and you may recognize the name of his son, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is going to be the one who takes his army, takes his father's army, and marches it to Carchemish. Now, why doesn't Nabopolassar go? There's some debate. Some think he was at this point getting too old. Some people say that he was sickly, and I think it's probably the latter. He was both, or a combination of both, but definitely the latter. In 605, he sends his son, and so Nabopolassar stays behind in Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar marches the Babylonian army all the way west. Now, I'm sure that at this time he has mercenaries along the way. He's got some of the Medes with him. This time he wants to finish the job once and for all, because you got to remember, this is quite a march to take an army all the way across that tract of land that you see up there on the map. And so in 605, as he is marching west, Pharaoh Necho hears word of it, and he gets there in time. This time he has lots of time. He has nothing is going to stop him as he marches up through the Levant, because he has his own men on all the thrones. And so he marches his army all the way to Carchemish, and there with the remaining army of the Assyrians and the Egyptians, they engage in battle against the Babylonians. And of course, the rest is history. The Babylonians defeat Egypt. They defeat the Assyrians in 605 at the Battle of Carchemish, and this is going to cause Judah to fall under the sway of the Babylonians. This is the life. Now, at this time, this is 605. This would mean that if Ezekiel is born in about 220 or 623, this would mean that he is approximately, 12 years old. 12, 4, I guess it was 23 and 6. Yeah, he would be, 17 years old. So he is a teenager, and this is what he's been witnessing for the past few years, is kind of that chaos. And so what Nebuchadnezzar does, when he kind of mops up around Carchemish, he gets word back from Babylon that his father has died. Now, in the ancient world, when a king died, that meant chaos ensued, and somebody else is going to try to go for the throne, especially if the heir apparent, in this case, it is Nebuchadnezzar, he's away in the field marching. So what he does is he leaves his army, he takes a small contingent, and he rushes back to Babylon to claim the throne. And so he marches all the way back and rushes back. He claims the throne, solidifies the throne literally within just a few weeks, and he turns around and heads back to join his army because he has something greater in store. He has to subjugate Egypt. He has to make sure, because Necho retreats and they take off and kind of licking their wounds. They're running back to Egypt, and while Babylon wants to make sure that Egypt isn't a threat anymore. And so what Nebuchadnezzar does is he goes back to Carchemish, he joins his military, and they begin to march south, and they begin to subjugate all of those little kinglets that were just originally 5 years earlier, 4 years earlier, put on the throne by Necho. And so he removes them or makes them swear allegiance, and he gets all the way down to Judah. And so by the time he gets there, it's about 605, early 604. And guess who he subjugates in Judah? None other than Jehoiakim. He makes him swear allegiance to the Babylonians and to renounce his allegiance to Pharaoh Necho and the Egyptians. And of course, Jehoiakim kind of sticks his finger into the air, senses the wind and which way the political winds are blowing, and he says, okay, I'll swear allegiance. And so here is poor Ezekiel as a teenager. He is watching this. He said, okay, in my lifetime, I've seen the Assyrians, I've seen the Egyptians, and now we have the Babylonians. And just to make sure that the people remain allies and do not try to rebel, Nebuchadnezzar decides to take all the best and the brightest of the young men from the court, and he takes their sons. This is when you have Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. All of those individuals are taken in roughly 605, 604. And Nebuchadnezzar takes them back, and this is the context of the book of Daniel. This is why Ezekiel chapter 14, I believe, actually mentions Daniel. You can't tell me that Ezekiel didn't know who Daniel was, because they were roughly the same age. Daniel, we know, lives all the way through into the Persian period, and most scholars believe that Daniel was probably about 14, 15 years old when he was taken into captivity. So that would make him almost the same age. Maybe Ezekiel was even a little older than Daniel. So this is the context, and of course we know when it comes to the re-education process, which I've talked about, Daniel is going to be re-educated, and I really think that Ezekiel ultimately was re-educated as well. And so that's kind of all the shifting that's taken place. So now we have in 605, we have the Egyptians are now subjugated, the Assyrians are never going to be seen again in history, and the Babylonians are the new elephant in the room. And this is all done within Ezekiel's short lifespan, from the time he was born until he's about 17 years old. Are there any questions on that up to this point?
I had a question.
Sure.
Did I hear you say that Jehoiakim was Pharaoh Necho's son?
No.
No.
I said Jehoiakim. I don't know whether you have that in front of you in your notes, but I will write this on the board. I don't know whether you can see this, and we're going to try it. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, Jehoiakim, he is going to be the individual who Pharaoh Necho put on the throne. Does that make sense? His brother, Jehoahaz, he was only on the throne for 3 months. It's very easy to remember this. Jehoahaz is the guy that was put on the throne by the men of Judah after the death of Josiah. He was only on there for 3 months. Pharaoh Necho is going to take him to Egypt, and Jehoahaz dies in Egypt. Jehoiakim comes to the throne. That's the guy that Pharaoh Necho puts on the throne. He's a pro-Egyptian, and he is going to be on the throne for 11 years. And so he is going to come on the throne in 609 BC. Jehoahaz was on the throne in 609 BC too, but he's only on there for 3 months. And so this is going to be the king. Jehoiakim is going to be the king that is going to see the rule of the Egyptians. He's also saw the rule of the Babylonians. And so he has switched allegiance. When Nebuchadnezzar showed up, Jehoiakim switches allegiance in 605, and he swears allegiance to the Babylonians. So it's this guy here, Jehoiakim. These are all sons of Josiah. These are his sons. And so these are all of the line of David, and so they're keeping the line of David going. But Jehoahaz, again, 3 months. Jehoiakim is going to be on there for 11 years, and we'll talk a little bit about what happens to him when he decides to rebel.
One question.
Yes.
You mentioned Second Kings. You also can read about this in First Chronicles. Where are those scriptures?
In Second Chronicles. I don't have my text straight in front of me. One moment, I will find it for you. It's a little more detailed in Second Chronicles because it actually records. One moment, I'll pull it up here. It actually records more of the. Just can't even spell tonight. Second Chronicles chapter 35, I believe, is where that is. Yeah, he celebrates the Passover. Yeah, it's in chapter 35 of Second Chronicles. And it's a little more detailed there than it is in 2 Kings chapter 23. Are there any other questions? Good? All right, we still haven't got Ezekiel to Babylon. We have got Daniel in Babylon now. That is what is known as the first exile. First exile takes place in 605, 604. And so that is going to be done under the period of Jehoiakim. So what happens from 605 down to 597? That's the next date I want to look at, 597. You'll probably see some of these dates again because these are some pretty key dates when we start dating the prophecies of Ezekiel. And just so you know, I have put on your website for this class, I've actually put the chronology of Ezekiel. You can actually print it off or pull it up electronically, and it has all the dates of the prophecies of Ezekiel, so you can access that. So what happens? Let's jump. I want to jump just a bit down to the period of 597. Everything is going well. The Egyptians are basically subjugated, even though Nebuchadnezzar is not going to completely subjugate them for some time. We do know that the men of Judah are basically behaving themselves for all intents and purposes. But what Jehoiakim begins to realize is that as the Egyptians regain their strength, because like I said, Nebuchadnezzar could not completely subjugate them, and when they begin to regain their strength, and when the men of Judah started realizing how much tribute they had to pay to the Babylonians, Jehoiakim's like, maybe it's a good idea for us to try joining with the Egyptians again. And so what he does is he rolls the dice, and he says, the Babylonians aren't going to march all their army all the way back, all the way over here to subjugate little Judah. We'll just stop paying tribute, and if we ever get into trouble, we'll just call the Egyptians. Now, you can read the book of Jeremiah, and he deals with this very closely because he's living in Jerusalem, and he is living this firsthand. And he is recognizing the fact, Jeremiah is saying, this is not a good plan. Because Jeremiah is seeing, spiritually speaking, Jeremiah is seeing the Babylonians as God's judgment against Judah for their sin and for their rebellion. And so here's Jehoiakim, and he's really, he's kind of a political hack this way because he's consistently switching. You can't trust him. And so he decides he is going to stop paying tribute, and lo and behold, what happens in 599, 598? When the tribute stops coming to Nebuchadnezzar, it's not that he is so much concerned about those few talents of gold, although that's important. What he's more concerned about is rebellion and losing control of all of those satellite little states that are along the coast that gives him direct access to Egypt. And so what he does is he marches his army all the way back over, down through the Levant, and he comes to Judah. And he is set on making sure that they don't rebel again. And so what happens is, and this is where Jeremiah and some of the material as far as the text is a little cryptic. We're not exactly sure what happens to Jehoiakim. According to Jeremiah, it seems like somebody killed him and threw his body over the wall. Because the text says, Jeremiah prophesies that Jehoiakim's body will be left to the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field. And so apparently before the Babylonians get there, they get rid of this guy because now the men of Judah and Jerusalem recognize we're in deep doo-doo here. Because the Babylonians are coming back and they're not going to be happy with the fact that we have rebelled. And so what they did is they got rid of Jehoiakim, threw him out threw his body out over, and basically don't give it a proper burial, which is going to be important later. And they placed a pro-Babylonian king on the throne, which just happens to be Jehoiakim's son. This is going to be Jehoiachin. So don't confuse him with his father. So technically Jehoiachin, and he is going to rule for 3 months. You see a pattern here developing? He is actually a grandson of Josiah. Jehoiakim is dead. Jehoiachin comes to the throne. He is only 18 years old. He is just a young man. And Jehoiachin, so this is, again, he's probably pretty close or maybe a little younger than Ezekiel at this point. And so what happens is when the Babylonians finally arrive, it takes them several months to actually get that army all the way there. Jehoiachin's only been on the throne for about 3 months, and he sees the handwriting on the walls, excuse the pun. And so what he does is he opens the city gates. He commands his army to open the city gates, and he throws himself on the mercy of the Babylonian army and Nebuchadnezzar. Well, surprisingly enough, and this is 597, surprisingly enough, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't kill him. What he does is he decides that he will put his own man on the throne instead of having this problem. So what he does is he takes Jehoiachin, and he takes all the seed royal, pretty much like his mom and all of the family, and what he's doing is he's skimming off the top. I like to look at it this way. Nebuchadnezzar first took Daniel and all of the upper crust, so kind of I call them the elite students of Israel. Now he comes in and he takes skims the second time, and he takes all of the kind of the ones that were associated with the royal throne. He takes all of the priests, a lot of the priests he takes with him, young men. This is when Ezekiel is going to go into exile. So in 597, Ezekiel is going to be roughly 23, 24, 25, 26 years old. So he is of the same generation as Jehoiachin, who is 18, 19 years old. And so what you have in 597, this is what is known as the second exile. So we've had the first exile in 605, 604. The second exile is going to take place in 597. Jehoiachin is going to go into exile, and along with him, you're going to also see Ezekiel. Now, there are a lot of other people that go with him, but Ezekiel, this is kind of his moment when he is never going to see his homeland again. And what Nebuchadnezzar does is he puts his own man on the throne, and he's actually going to be a son of Josiah. His Jewish name is Mattaniah, but in this case, Nebuchadnezzar is going to rename him, and he's going to call him Zedekiah. Zedekiah is going to be on the throne for 11 years. So do you see the pattern? Jehoahaz, 3 months. Jehoiakim, 11 years. Jehoiachin, 3 months. Zedekiah, 11 years. And so this is the rapid things that are going on in the political system of Judah at this time. And this is the turmoil in which Ezekiel is growing up. And you may begin to appreciate why when we start reading Ezekiel chapter 1, why it has such a dark tone to it. Because here is a guy who is really upset. We're going to see that when he should be starting his work in the temple, he is going to find himself in exile. And so everything he's worked for all of his life as a teenager and as a young man is now gone. So in 597, this is when Ezekiel is going to find himself in Babylon. And from this point on, you are going to see that his message is going to be set and rooted in that ancient Babylonian context. Are there any questions on that? I don't know. I'm just going to check what my PowerPoints are, so we'll slide to the next one. I don't know whether you can see that there. You can pull up the next one, Lynn.
All right.
The next PowerPoint.
Yep.
Dr. Peterson,
Yes.
can you repeat again who Zedekiah was the son of?
Josiah.
Or Zedekiah was?
Zedekiah is the son of Josiah. Yeah, in this particular case, what happens is Nebuchadnezzar wants to keep somebody who is brought up in the royal house so they know how to rule. He just wants somebody that's pro-Babylonian. He's tired of this. And how do you keep them loyal? This time he's going to take his brother. So that's why his nephew. That's why he takes Jehoiachin. Now what's interesting about Ezekiel is a lot of scholars actually believe that Ezekiel feels that Jehoiachin is the right king or the true king. Because he doesn't die. He goes into exile. And so a lot of the times what you'll see, Ezekiel seems to be referencing or understanding Jehoiachin as the actual king. Zedekiah is nothing but a mere puppet and placed on the throne by the king of Babylon. So when you look at Jeremiah and what's going on with him, and you look at what's going on with Ezekiel, you can begin to appreciate kind of that turmoil that they have gone through. And this spiritual setting is going to be, for him, it's going to change his whole spiritual perspective. That's why you're going to see an Ezekiel, like I said, who has a very harsh tone, but he's also a man who contemplates a lot, who fasts, who prays for his nation, much like Jeremiah. So out of that political turmoil, it literally drove Ezekiel to God's going to call him, but he's going to become a prophet, and it's going to change his spiritual outlook, and it's going to give him kind of an urgency of the hour. And again, we could apply this all day long. When you look at kind of the chaos, not only in the world, but just within the political setting, it drives us to our knees to pray and for things to be, even so, Lord Jesus, come quickly, so to speak. So we can pick up with what you have here on the PowerPoint. Are there any questions at this point? We good? I'll tell you what we'll do is I'll lecture until about 9 o'clock. And that way, that'll give me a little bit of break, and we'll take about a 5 to 7 minute break because I know we got started late. And that way you won't have to listen to me for 2 hours straight, ramble on. And you can actually, if you have to go to the washroom or whatever, you can. And so what I want to do, Ezekiel delivers a very similar message to Jeremiah, as Jeremiah does to the exiles. When you start comparing the message of Ezekiel to the message of Jeremiah, you will find they have a very similar message. And one of the kind of the heart of their message is the fact that the exile is going to be long. They're not getting out of this easy. And like I said, for the most part, you have a lot of false prophets that are ministering and saying that the exile will be short. It's only going to be about 70 years. All we have to do is, a couple of years. All we have to do is just hold out, and God is going to deliver us from the Babylonians. Well, that's what Jeremiah has to minister against, and Ezekiel has the exact same context, because there are false prophets who went with him into exile, and they're saying the same thing. And so this is spiritually what he's up against. In other words, in both Judah and in the exile, there are people who simply will refuse to accept the judgment of God, and they're going to try to buck it all the way and push against it. And so this is why you have these two prophets with a very similar message. The other thing that is interesting about Ezekiel is the fact that his ministry really only covers a short period of time, from 593 to 571. And like I said, between now and next week, if you can, or even at the break, if you want to pull up that the handout I sent with the chronology, you will actually see how all of his prophecies are dated between 593 and 571. So he is not really going to start his ministry until about 2 years, 3 years, or I should say 3, 4, 5 years, depending on how you date this. Roughly 4 years, I guess we could say, after he is taken into exile in 597. So God's going to allow him a little bit of time to acclimate, so to speak. One of the other things about him is that he is a priest. He is the priestly clan, much like Jeremiah. He's probably not from the same priestly line as Jeremiah. Does anybody know what the priestly line of Jeremiah was?
Probably of the line of Aaron, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, but there are different families, right? He is actually from the priests of Anathoth, goes all the way back through Abiathar. He is of one of the sons of Aaron, but the other one is Zadok. And Ezekiel seems to be of the sons of Zadok. And then this goes back to all the way to the period of David and Solomon. When David has two priests, he has Abiathar and he has Zadok. Abiathar is from Anathoth, and you actually have Jeremiah from that family. And so they're from two different competing families of the priests. They're still, I mean, I'm not saying that they're competing necessarily, but they are from two different families. And the men of Anathoth and the men of Zedekiah, or of Zadok in his line, are actually, they vie for the power of the high priesthood. And for all intents and purposes, the line of Zadok is what wins the day after the period of David. So we have here the next thing on the PowerPoint, you'll see that you have Daniel and Ezekiel are exiles. These are the dates. These are key dates. So 604 is the first exile. 597 is going to be the second exile. And as I've noted in Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 14, 20, and then again in 28, verse 3, you're going to see that he mentions Daniel specifically. Now, we'll have a discussion when we get to those chapters, because within scholarship, that's one thing that they will not tolerate, is to allow this to be the same Daniel that goes into exile. And so they are going to opt for a different Daniel, somebody from one of the surrounding nations, which I think is kind of special pleading, but we'll talk about that when we get there. And of course, the other thing that I want to point out is the fact that we have what is classified as probably a re-education process that takes place when Ezekiel gets to Babylon. And the reason that he would probably be re-educated is due to the fact that as an educated individual who could read and write, the Babylonian leadership liked to re-educate them in a way that they could go and teach the exiles. And so it was very common for them to teach them in the ways of the Babylonians. And of course, that's exactly what we read in Daniel chapter 1. Are there any questions on that? We good? All right. For the rest of the class, what I would like to do is I would like to switch and look at some of the scholarly issues about authorship. And the reason, again, I do this is, and I'll try to make this as painless as possible, but we'll work through some of the details of what scholars have done with the book of Ezekiel, because once we kind of get that hammered out, you'll understand why I come at it from a very unified perspective, and that Ezekiel is in fact the author of it. But before we do that, like I said, what I wanted to do is I wanted to set up and kind of make a switch from the world of the Bible to the world of scholarship. And so that's what I want to talk about for the next little bit. Before I do that, are there any questions? Are we good to move forward? We'll talk for about 10 minutes on this, and then we will move to a break, and then we'll finish out the class. All right. So you should have the next slide up there, one on authorship. Have you got that one?
Yes.
Yes. All right. It should say up until the 20th century, the authorship was unquestioned.
Yep.
Okay, we're good. All right. That statement, that beginning statement, is pretty much self-explanatory. Really, until that time period of the early 1900s, no one questioned this book as being nothing other than the book of Ezekiel, written by Ezekiel, written in Babylon. What happened is, right at the rise, at the turn of the 20th century to the 1900s, This is when we have a rise in historical critical method, and I'm sure that you've probably been introduced to this a little bit, probably within your studies. But this is when they start basically challenging every aspect of the text. Authorship is one of the first things that they question. And so German scholarship in particular began to apply critical methods, historical critical methods on source criticism, on redaction criticism, how it was edited, and so forth. And so what they came up with, they said there are multiple authors. We have a Palestinian Ezekiel, and we have a bunch of Babylonian, we have at least one Babylonian Ezekiel. And so I call these the Palestinian and the Babylonian Ezekiels. And this came from the different settings. They argued that there are different kind of historical or geographical settings, I should say, that we find within the book of Ezekiel. And some of this, they say, so the way they present it is they say the one who is in Palestine, he is, and I use Palestine, that's their language. I do not like that term myself. I think it's Israel. I think that's the better term, but that's the language that they use. And so they say there was one portion of Ezekiel's ministry that he wrote in Jerusalem before he went into exile. And so we're going to see portions of that, maybe portions of chapter 11, maybe a little bit of chapter 10 and 9. But some of that in chapter 8 are all coming from Ezekiel when he was in before he went to Babylon. And so you have some that were written, some argue that there are portions of Ezekiel that were written even as late as the post-exilic period. And so what you'll see here in position number 1, and I'll just kind of work through these different positions. In position number 1, the majority of scholars have actually come to the conclusion that most of the book of Ezekiel was in fact written in Babylon, and that it only had minor revisions taking place in the post-exilic period. That's the majority position. Now, unfortunately, there is also a large group in the minority position that have a lot of different theories. And so the second one there is that Ezekiel wrote in Jerusalem and in Babylon, as I've noted. The third position on the next slide is that Ezekiel wrote in Babylon, but it has had a major Palestinian revision. In other words, they'll say that the book was written, a good portion of it was written when Ezekiel was in Babylon, but then after the exile, when the children of Israel went back, when they went back to Jerusalem, what happened is that it was later that somebody sat down, maybe one of the disciples of Ezekiel, and they went through a major revision. And they updated stuff, and they added stuff, and made it look like Ezekiel is prophesying stuff when he actually, of course, you could never have Ezekiel actually foresee in the future. And so some of that stuff that has a more prophetic aspect to it, they said, well, that was added at a later time period. And so they have this in the third position. Ezekiel wrote most of it in Babylon, but it has a major Palestinian revision. In the fourth section, you actually have the fourth one. Ezekiel wrote in Jerusalem, and another person wrote in Babylon. So they argue that Ezekiel never went to Babylon at all, that it is somebody writing in his name. And so you have kind of the whole thing being rewritten in Babylon, and we don't know for sure who that is. Now, for me, when I read this, I just kind of chuckle and I say, well, there's really no textual proof for this. And so as long as we don't have a textual proof, I'm going to say that Ezekiel went into exile, and he's the one that wrote it. The fifth and the sixth one, these ones are really minority positions. Ezekiel is a Palestinian pseudepigraph. Do you know what I mean when I say a pseudepigraph?
Someone else did it?
Yeah, somebody else is writing it. So in other words, this is somebody who wrote it at a much later period, and probably as late as even the 3rd century BC. It's well after the fact, and it's somebody just kind of like the Book of Enoch. They're adding the name to it. And so this, again, is a very minority position. And the last one I just quickly want to go over is the book was originated in Babylon, but it had a long history of redactions. And maybe some Deutero-Ezekiel guy comes along, still under the name of Ezekiel, because it's kind of a second Ezekiel, and they start adding stuff to it at a much later date. That's kind of the overview of the 6 different positions. Again, just so you know, my position is position number 1. I think that it was probably mostly written in the or in the period of the exile. All right, so that's the overview. Any questions?
Go ahead. Dr. Peterson, what about the Jewish position on the authorship?
That's a great question. After the break, we're actually going to look at a couple of the Jewish positions on that. They're pretty much split. One of the things you're going to find about Jewish scholarship today is that a majority of it has bought into pretty much a Western mindset of minimalism. And by minimalism, I mean they believe very little of the biblical text is history. And of course, I'm sure you had this discussion. If anybody's had Dr. Stripling, you will recognize very quickly within archaeology, this is the same thing that's going on, where you have a very minimalist perspective of what is history coming out of the ground. And that's why something like ABR, Associates for Biblical Research, we are actually a very minority voice in this regard. So yeah, we'll look at, Moshe Greenberg is one of the guys we're going to look at after break. He is very much what I classify, or was, I should say, he died in 2010. But he was very much more of a maximalist on how he read Ezekiel. And you can actually find his commentaries. I think he wrote it for the Word Biblical Commentary, if I recall. He's written commentaries on Ezekiel. Ed, did you have a question?
I did. On position number 1,
Yes.
that position describes some post-exilic additions. Is there any position that believes the book in its entirety was written in Babylon?
That it's entirely written in Babylon?
Yes.
I mean, you'll get the odd individual, and I don't mean that in a bad sense. And I think that the majority, when I say I'm position number 1, I would say that probably somewhere in the vicinity of 99% of that is all from Ezekiel. As you're reading through my book, you'll see every now and again I'll make a note. This might be something that was added later, but when I say minimal, I mean a few verses at most is where I'd be. And within that position number 1, you get the whole gamut. You'll have people who will say, there's maybe 20, 30 verses. Some will say a few chapters. Some will say something like, for example, 40 to 48 was added later, but everything else is from Babylon. I think it is all very much kind of the structure and everything is coming out of Babylon from Ezekiel.
Thank you.
Yep. And hopefully you'll pick that up as you're reading through the text, through the book, that I have a very high view of that it only makes sense that it's coming from the hand of Ezekiel for the unity of it.
Well, and the other thing that for me just when I read it, it just seems like his ministry started then, and that's where he was. So it just makes sense to me that that's where it would all be, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's when I first started writing on this, my PhD committee, who are not as much of a maximalist as I am, because I was at the University of Toronto, I know that they were probably kind of cringing because I wanted to argue for the unity of the book. And along with the unity comes authorship issues, right? Who is actually writing this to make it unified? And that's why at the very end of my book, you'll find under implications, I did a section on implications and conclusion. I actually say, my goodness, this certainly sounds like one guy wrote it all in Babylon. And so I find myself falling into that camp. All right, before we jump into that next section, where I'm going to unpack a little bit of what I just gave you the overview of, why don't we take a 5-7 minute break, and you can stretch your legs and get some water, coffee, whatever it is you need, and we'll come back and we'll try to finish this out. Len, do you want to try sending me another link to my Lee account to see if I can get the other board up and running?
Sure.
If it doesn't work, that's fine, but I thought we would try it. We can try it. If it doesn't work, I'll use the board behind me.
All right, well, I'll try it. Send you a link again. I've got you in the system to to invite you just by contact
Okay.
instead of by email, but that doesn't seem to be working. And you've got both of your accounts named Brian Peterson, so I can't tell which one's going to which email address.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know who, like I had the Lee guys set some of that up, and that's probably what's going on. Well, I tell you what, I can send you a request because I think this one is good for at least an hour, hour and a half, my free account.
Okay, yeah, you should be able to just invite contact, like if you click there.
Okay, just wait. I will,
If you go to
yeah,
your
see, I just got that from you and you sent it to I just received this. So let's try this one.
Yep. Well, on the main Zoom account window, totally apart from this window, there's a place where it lists your contacts.
You right?
You can invite the Bible Seminary to connect. I think I've invited you and you've accepted, but it says it's waiting for approval. So do you have a message somewhere on one of your accounts that's a chat message or something where you're supposed to approve an invite?
Well, right now what's happening is I can see myself come up in the screen.
Yep.
I can see your stuff, but my computer is thinking. It's just sitting there spinning.
Okay.
And so, yeah, see, right now it's doing what it did last time. It just locked up. I guess it's unlocking there. I've got over to the one side. It says it's showing us. I mean, this push on contacts. See, I think what's happening is.
So I've
See,
got
of course-
one. I've got one that says waiting on approval, and then another Brian Peterson that says you're offline.
Okay, join. Okay, here we go.
Contact list.
I'm going to mute this one. All right, that should be working there. Yes.
All right. Yeah, I've got you on both of them now.
Okay, we got it. So I don't know whether you can mark which one that was. That was.
Yeah, actually, one of them says Brian Peterson, and the other says B. Peterson. But
Okay.
I was thinking the one that I just sent is your Lee University. And
It is.
Okay, the one you're currently sitting at says B. Peterson, so that would be not.
That's my Hotmail.
Yeah, that would not be the same convention, but I'll try to remember that it's opposite.
Okay. I just realized I'm going to have to plug my computer in. I'll be right back.